and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in virtual online meetings, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era. Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Daughters, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable and effective. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily.
It's great to be here again, back with all of you in September. I love this month, Martin. How about you?
It's normally really good in Ireland, Paul, but I'm afraid we've gotten off to a bad start this year. We had a fantastic August and September, not so good. But I'm looking forward to October because I'm going to spend 10 days in Spain.
Wow,
So,
wow.
Yeah, so that's good, something nice to look forward to.
That's something very good to look forward. And this day, I'm so pleased to host two guest speakers from the other side of the Atlantic, specifically the country that I love the most in North America, Canada. With us today, we have two guest speakers that I'm sure they're going to introduce themselves in a minute or so. But first of all, Martin, we normally start by asking this typical question in our events.
It's a slightly cheeky, chappy sort of little question, but we always like to ask people, is there something about your past that generally isn't very well known about you, but you could be happy to share with our audience in our discussions today?
Oh my goodness.
Okay, I'll give it, because Martin and I had teased this a little bit actually just a few minutes ago. So what is not well known is that Claire and I met in a warehouse about 27 years ago.
Yes, she's aging us now, but we were really young.
Yeah. So that was the beginning of our journey as colleagues and friends, and we were in a warehouse.
Yes, that is not well known. The other thing that's not well known is that Tamara's hair was partially pink.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Oh, Paul, I suspect we could have a whole session about pink hair in a warehouse 22 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll have to leave that for a slightly more reflective moment. Yeah.
All right. Well,
So
it just goes to show that friendships and colleagues and paths and professional journeys often start in the most unlikely of places.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Paul, maybe at some stage we'll reflect on how you and I got together online, and actually we've never met in person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What?
Yeah, we've been working together, I think 4 years now, Paul.
Yeah.
On various, yes, and we haven't actually met in person yet, which is extraordinary. But that's Claire, you just mentioned about pandemics and how it changed our lives. That's one thing that came out of the pandemic for Paul and myself. So but still, we're none the worse for it at the moment anyway. It's
absolutely. And what brings us all here together is our passion, our love for meetings and meeting performance and meeting effectiveness. This is the monster we all have to deal, or the most pleasurable experience in our lives. It all depends, right? But we want to listen from you, ladies, your experience about organizational meetings, right? Because we're not talking here about weddings. But then let me throw you this to start the conversation. What would happen if we start thinking about every organizational meeting as a wedding?
Wow.
I like that thinking.
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is who's invited and who gets to participate and where do you seat people at the table. And in weddings, there's, I think, a tremendous amount of control over where people are placed. And you also perhaps are excluding people in weddings. So I'm not necessarily looking at this as a, take the lessons from weddings, but this would be like some lessons maybe you don't want to take from weddings, which is you don't want to invite people you don't like or who are contrary to your lives at your wedding. But in a meeting, actually, I think you do, depending on what the purpose of that meeting is. But I think actually you do want the multiple perspectives, and you might not want to, you might want to control a little bit about who sits where, but you might be a little bit more open. I think there's a slightly different lens that you might take.
I think that's an interesting way to look at meetings, only from the perspective, or not, I shouldn't say only, but from one of the perspectives is that there's a clear host. And the outcome or the participation or the enjoyment of the wedding then becomes really incumbent on the host to ensure that there's an element of hospitality and inclusiveness in making sure that everybody is there to participate and enjoy. And so I think there's some elements of that thought around bringing people together that don't typically all know each other. It's the idea of now in the world of global organizations and having to sometimes meet with a frequency that surpasses what we would have traditionally been able to do by getting on a plane. These Just Like Us are having a meeting today in 4 different time zones, and yet we're all on the screen together. And so there is that element of having a clear host and a clear purpose, and really taking into account the needs of the people that are being invited or around the table.
Yeah, you really touched on, between both of you there, actually, I think you've touched on 3 really interesting key points for me anyway. Who's invited? Who attends? Where people are seating, the significance of seating one way or the other. And the whole idea of equal participation. Tamara, Claire, I'll come back. Might come back to the host question, because I think that's a separate concept. But let's say wrapping it around the participants, this idea of the invitees. Could I just explore that with you from both your perspectives, Tamara, from say your facilitation experience, and Claire from your, let's call it, management experience of having come through multiple organizations at multiple levels. Could you talk to us a little bit about the invitees? Who should or shouldn't be invited to meetings, and where do boundaries get drawn and so on?
Well, I think like when I'm working with clients and they'll say, we need to achieve this and we need help facilitating this conversation or this decision-making process or strategic process. And so one of my first questions is, who is going to be there, or who do you plan on actually being there and attending? And sometimes in that conversation, they start to talk it out. They're like, well, we should have this person and that team and maybe this person over there. And then somebody might say, but let's not invite them. I mean, they just they're always against, what we're setting out to do. And they're just gonna, sit there with their arms crossed, or they have these strongly contrary views to what we're trying to do. And my answer will almost always be, then they absolutely need to be in that room. You need to have them there with a facilitated kind of structured process so that their view can work its way in. Perhaps it actually has a perspective to offer that you hadn't thought of before. Or if you don't include that person, that voice, or that perspective in the room at that time, you're going to be dealing with it later anyway. So you might as well do it in a constructive, productive kind of way instead of that person being like out in the hallway, being frustrated that they're not actually being heard. So I'll almost always say, throw the net wide, the more the merrier. But at the same time, you want to answer the question, who do we need in the room to be able to provide all the knowledge, the perspective, the facts and stats that we need to answer the question we have in front of us. And so that's when they start to think, oh, wait a second, we need somebody from this other team because we're going to be working with them at the back end. Why not have them at the front end of this? And I think that can always or often be very helpful. So purpose before process, purpose before participants. But at the same time, I tend to be fairly inclusive in who gets to who might be included in the meeting or the workshop.
Yeah. Claire,
I do very much value the inclusiveness of a meeting, but it also brings us then to the second point, is that you can invite people to a meeting, but how do you construct a meeting so that everybody's got an equal voice, so that the participants that are invited to the meeting have the ability to be able to share their perspectives openly and generate discussion without those preconceived notions of others wanting or not wanting a particular viewpoint in the room. And that is where, it is incumbent upon the facilitators or the host, or again, where purpose drives the outcome of the meeting, where you can help direct conversation so that those that are invited have the opportunity to actually speak and hold space in the room. And that often, I think, is where sometimes our leadership teams can perhaps overlook the importance of that. So it's not just about sending out the invitations. It's really about thinking about the purpose of the meeting and how do we get the voices and the perspectives in the room that is required.
Yeah, and that actually prompts me to ask what I think is maybe a logical follow-on. So what's your thoughts on the scale of the participants, the number of people that we bring along to a particular meeting? Because it goes to the heart of people getting heard, having an opportunity to engage, to take part. What's your thinking on that then?
Well, I think you can have. Oh, sorry, Claire, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, please go and then I'll follow.
I think you can have a meeting of 300 people and it can still be purposeful, meaningful, engaging, and inclusive. It's just all about the process that you choose to use. You can have a meeting with 3 people and somebody can feel completely shut down. So I don't think it's about size so much. I mean, I think you have to be very thoughtful in, sometimes we'll work with teams where let's say they have kind of a new leader and there's some changes going on in the organization. And let's say they have a team of 200 people with different kind of strata within that team. We might say, look, you're creating a new vision, you're creating a new direction, but let's actually just start with your senior team and make sure your senior team is all on the same page before you start including and bringing in everyone else into the vision and into the future of what you're setting out to do. So you have to just really think like, what needs to be done in this moment? Well, right now we need to make sure that, for example, the 4 of us are truly and clearly on the same page before we start engaging the rest of the teams. Then another situation, you might have, a team that is already, leadership team already highly functioning. You're introducing something new in the organization. It's just like, all right, let's go. Let's just start, bringing people in. So it's all depends on what your situation is, and what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, there.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Tamara in principle. When you are having a meeting where your numbers are starting to exceed the comfort of the room, I do think space is really important if it's an in-person meeting. I think being very mindful of what is comfortable, the length of the meeting, and some of the nuances around bringing people together, I think are very important. Even so much as to say ahead of time how long the meeting is going to be and where the breaks will be. I do think that there's some of those nuances around bringing large groups together. There are some of those necessities that are required in order to be able to have a meeting that has flow. When you have a smaller group, some of those things can be done ad hoc. But as your numbers start to get bigger and start to capacity constraints become a reality, the size of the room and audio becomes a consideration. As soon as those things start to happen, I think that's where a rethink may be required in order to either have more than one meeting, split the sessions in two, have them facilitated a little differently. But oftentimes it helps to have your leadership team again around the table in order to be able to ensure that everybody is moving and in the right direction collaboratively.
It makes me think a lot about time and
Yes.
how important time allocation is. Either your complete time for the meeting or workshop, how long you're giving it, and also how you manage time within it. It's extremely important. And the bigger the numbers get, as Claire is saying, the more it's kind of a little bit of a math equation as well. You have to be thinking, like I've had, sometimes I'll coach leaders as they're trying to develop their own processes to lead meetings themselves. And they'll come back to me, here's my process plan. And I'm like, okay, you put 5 people in this. I mean, this might sound like minor details, but it does matter to the experience of the participants and the outcomes. You put 5 people at a breakout room, you've given 5 minutes, and the topic is, what do we dream of for the future of our organization? And I'm like, do you understand that's 1 minute of airtime per person, if that, right? So you kind of have to do the math, or like you have really big numbers. It actually takes 10 minutes to move people around a room or from breaks or things like that. So even if the meeting is short, thinking about that time for people, we book meetings in hour-long segments. Why isn't it 50, right? And now with virtual, oh my heavens, like virtual and the way in which it's exhausting people to have these, and they just jump off. They're like, gotta go, bye, and they disappear, and it's just so inhuman, and off they go to their, they don't have time to think or anything. Like, we've got to figure out a better way of doing that, right? There's serious meeting overload. And Martin, you're saying, like, years ago, and certainly when Claire and I first met, meetings were like occasional.
Yes.
Oh, we're going to have a management meeting once a week on Thursday afternoon at 2:00, and then your team meeting is Monday morning. And now it's, that's all people do. They don't actually create or produce anything. They don't actually do who's doing the work? I always wonder who's doing the actual work, because everybody's just meeting all the time.
There's a little cheat that I use when I meet a client for the first time and we're talking about facilitating either routine meetings or we're talking about special events. But I normally take the example of your typical 1-hour management team meeting. There's typically, say there's a big team, there's 12 people in it. I said 12 into 60 gives 5 minutes talking time per person. If you spread it evenly, and this is the cheat, say, but that requires 55 minutes of listening time from everybody else. I said, is your group equipped to listen to everybody for 55 minutes in a condensed hour space? So I don't focus on the 5 minutes talk time. I focus on the 55 minutes listen time. And I say, now figure out your numbers. But here's the conundrum that poses. So if somebody says, okay, we'll just bring 5 people. So my proposition is we can have unrepresentative meetings. In other words, we've got small, manageable numbers that can have serious, meaningful, in-depth conversation with good airtime and listening time. Or we can have big meetings with a lot of people, less airtime, less listening, or more listening time. But my question then is, do we want to be unrepresentative or potentially dysfunctional in the size of the meetings? And how do we avoid being either of those two? If we get too big, we can become dysfunctional. If we get too small, we might become unrepresentative.
Well, I don't think that the size should be related to your purpose. So do you need everyone there to hear everything? And if you do, then bring them all, but use a process that uses dyads and triads and small groups so that there is more airtime and it's also a big energy shift and a big listening shift for people. So, use tools and techniques that allow for high levels of participation in a short period of time with a lot of people. If you need all those people. If you don't need all those people, then don't have all those people, right? I think it's does it serve your purpose to have everyone there? Now, in a lot of the work that I do, it's usually a slightly larger group, anywhere from 10, 25, 30 people in a typical kind of workshop environment. But my task is to help them collaborate or co-create or strategize. So that's the purpose of it. And you do need them all there. And so we just use tools and use processes that allow the kind of maximum airtime. And one of the things, might be small, but it's been a shift for me over the years is, when I first became a facilitator, it was always like, well, once you have your small groups, everyone then has to share back. And then you have like an hour of everybody sharing back exactly what they just talked about in their small groups. And it's so painful. Yeah. So I basically eliminated the share back. Yeah. And I do other things like gallery walks, like go and look at what other people have produced out of it. Or you have them share back in a creative way that it's like 1 minute, things like that. So I think I like that what you're saying about how much capacity do you have for listening. And I think another way to think of this is don't design, like you can design for time and you can design for participants, and airtime, but also design for energy, right? Think about the energy of the group and design whatever it is you're doing, even if it's a small management team meeting, design for energy. And you can consider, does this even need to be, some people say that could have been an email. It didn't need to be a meeting. But I also say it doesn't always need to be a workshop. What other ways can you engage people in a meaningful way that isn't in a room sitting at tables and chairs? Right. So, and I think there are actually lots of different activities you can do as well.
I think that's such an interesting point because my mind goes to, we're talking about meetings, but my mind does go to, is it a meeting to begin with? And I think that's when you said, could this be an email? And I think about how many things in an organization, big or small, or decisions that need to be made on a day-to-day basis. And some organizations have a culture of being very collaborative. And so then bringing people together becomes part of their decision-making process. And that's the culture of the organization. But really, I think when it comes down to deciding when do you have a meeting, again, we go back to what we started in this conversation. And again, the purpose. Is the purpose to inform? Is the purpose to work, as in to work through a problem, solution, something very specific? Is it a meeting where you're asking people to brainstorm? Is it a creative session where you are thinking about strategy, future-proofing a business, whether or not you're starting to get your organization moving across on a path to growth, or not? But again, it's the purpose of the meeting ends up driving things like who gets invited, right back to that starting sentiment. And then those allowances for time and listening and energy. And I think if there's a little bit more thoughtfulness at the front end of whether or not you actually schedule the meeting, I think then all these things that we're talking about become real conversations, and real points of making sure that, again, the effectiveness of the time together becomes exactly what we're striving for.
Yeah.
Sorry, Martin, go ahead.
From what both of you have said, something has just come into my mind. The fact that you both have worked closely with each other, the fact that you know each other really well, but clearly from your responses, you're viewing meetings from quite different perspectives. So Claire, you're viewing them from an executive perspective, and Tamara, you're from a facilitative perspective. Could I ask both of you your experience of executives, of managers thinking about meetings in the way, Tamara, that you have articulated? Do executives think about meetings in that sort of flexible way? Or, Claire, from your experience, do managers more think about meetings in a unitary sort of way, without the flexibility of purpose, types of meetings, options for different structures, different processes? What's your respective experiences of that from the executive manager's point of view?
Tamara, do you want to go first?
Well, I'll tell a story. This was many years ago, and actually Claire knows this situation. So I was working with a team. We were going to do a collaborative workshop, and they had to have the proposal approved by someone in HR. And this person had no communication with any of us around this in advance. So all she was doing was looking at the proposal. And of course, as a facilitator, you have time built in at the front end to plan for what you're about to do. And she came back to me when we were talking, and she said, what's all this time you have at the front end? Aren't you good enough that you can just walk in the room and start doing it? And so that was, this was a while ago. Okay. So that organization has now since evolved to understand kind of the collaborative process and the facilitated process a lot more. But at that time it was, that was how things were seen. You just walk in the room and you start doing it. And so I think there are still, that's still out there in kind of the executive world, which is, they're not thinking about kind of structuring things or designing the meeting. Even the smallest meeting, you can have a framework for it. So for example, Claire, who is very experienced with collaborative meetings, is, brought up, what is the purpose of this? And is it to inform? Is it to consult? Is it to involve? And that's, there's an organization called IAP2, which I think probably Martin and Paul are familiar with, which is the International Association for Public Participation. And they have a spectrum of public participation, which says before you start engaging people, and it's not just meetings, it's all kinds of engagements. Before you start engaging people, ask yourself, are we just informing them? Are we consulting them, getting their feedback and opinion on something? Are we involving them, a little more active? Are we collaborating with them? So we're actually going to decide solutions together. Or are we empowering them to make a decision? Are they going to be the decision-making body? And first you start with where on the spectrum does this fit? And if it's informed, then maybe it can be an email, right? Or some other form of communication. If it's, collaborate and empower, then you probably need a really highly designed kind of process. If it's consult, do you just need focus groups? Like your choice of process or tool follows from that. So when you think what's happening in the minds of some executives, well, even now, still, I work with, or experienced senior people who are just like, well, can't you just walk in and start? Don't we just walk in and we just start talking?
Oh.
But a little bit more thought in advance, and you could have far more effective meetings. Even small management meetings with 5 people could be even better with a little structure, a little format.
I think one of the things that Tamara just touched on that I was going to start with was just around that thoughtfulness beforehand. And I keep going back to that purpose. And to answer your question, Martin, really, I feel as though meetings and their purpose has evolved over the course of not only my career, but I think has evolved over different perhaps phases in the market, and we'll talk about the pandemic and what that meant. But again, I do feel as though the awareness around being able to be collaborative and creating space around the table for diverse voices and diverse thinking is really at the forefront of our leaders' minds. And we're not always good at it. So the intention around being purposeful in meetings is really something that requires quite a bit of thought on the front end. And I do feel as though we're getting better at it. I think we're on a good path. Are we always good at it? No. But I do use Tamara as a facilitator or facilitators when I need to be an equal participant in the meeting.
Yeah.
So when I need multiple voices to be heard, when we're looking to strategize, when we're looking to creatively solve for something, when we're looking to really manage change with a large group, I really do turn to facilitated sessions so that regardless of level or experience, tenure, the voices around the table are all equal. And that ultimately is what drives better outcomes. So having the experience of a facilitated session then allows you to be really mindful of the outcomes that you want when you set a meeting agenda. And when we go back to that sense of time, how much of it do you need to achieve, again, in a short period of time or a long period of time, depending again on what that purpose of your meeting is. So I do sort of start again with Tamara's comment there, just around again that purpose.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of really well-intended leaders who do want to be inclusive, but don't necessarily have the techniques, right, to do that. So I hear from people. I've had some coaching conversations recently where they've said, well, I want to include and engage people in this conversation or in this they're developing a new kind of culture within their organization. We want to include people. We want to hear their ideas, but they just sit there like this, or they don't open their mouths, or they don't say anything. And I'm get frustrated because I put it out there. I say, what are your ideas? And what do you think? And then they don't say anything. And I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get them to talk. And so I think this is where there's like just a little upskilling can be really helpful for a leader who has the best of intentions and wants to be inclusive. It's just learning like a small toolkit of techniques to help to get people to talk and engage in a way that feels meaningful for them. And there's a lot that can be done. But I got to tell you, people are exhausted too. Like leaders and team members alike are just burnt out. So they're running from meeting to meeting or clicking from meeting to meeting, and they don't have time to pause and think, oh, what's the structure of my meeting going to be, and how am I going to be, have a technique. They're just like diving in, taking a deep breath, going for it, having the next conversation, running to the next one. They're really burnt out. And I think that just the swamp and I guess or waterfall of meetings that everybody is experiencing now is quite tiring for people. And
why
they
is
don't.
that? Where do you think that's coming from?
I think Claire can jump in about the pandemic now.
Yeah, I think there is probably a number of things that lead to the number of meetings. One is technology enables us to be able to do it. Whereas probably before, in order to be able to get someone into a meeting, it would take a bit of coordination and logistics. So one, it's just easier to set a meeting up. Technology through Teams, Zoom, and whatever software you use, it's just easy to schedule it. You don't need to go check everybody's schedule. You can actually see what people's availability is online. And we don't make allowances for, where location is no longer a barrier. So I think one is technology has just allowed us to become it, to do it fairly easily. So I think that's one thing. I think this other thing too is, I think naturally we really do like brainstorming, connecting with people, building relationships. Those are all some things that happen when you meet with someone, whether it's one-on-one or otherwise. It's amazing the connections that you can make just by having a conversation. And sometimes it's the pre-meeting or in the post-meeting when you really start to get to know people and their colleagues. So I think there's that piece too. And I think in some respects, I wouldn't say that all meetings aren't worth it. I mean, there's so many times when we get together and something comes out of a meeting that you didn't even intend. Sometimes you're able to solve for something really quickly, just with a meeting rather than, 20 emails going back and forth. So I think it's just the desire to get off screen in a way of, this email exchange or document exchange, to actually being able to have a discussion. And I think that ultimately underlies, that ability for us to be able to connect or want to connect with someone. And just before I'll complete that thought, and then also know that in larger organizations and even in small ones, some of the things that we actually think about in meetings is it is a form of public speaking. And you think about people that have social anxieties around speaking in front of others. You think about people that are neurodiverse and require different environmental considerations before they can actually join in a meeting. I think about people who, have a hard time speaking in front of a particular gender or otherwise. And so I do think about those things as well when we think about inclusiveness post-pandemic and thinking about some of the things that we've become more mindful of. So anyway, those are my two thoughts on that.
Claire, my sense from what you said there is not that it's contradictory of Tamara's point, but it's a reverse side of Tamara's point. So on the one hand, is there an avalanche of meetings? On the other hand, is there an opportunity in that avalanche for people connection, for personal interactions, that pre-meeting get-togethers that you mentioned, Claire, the post-meeting, and it might only be 30 seconds. It might be just asking, how's your partner, or how's the new baby, or how's the dog that you bought out? but it's so this idea of meetings are essential to us as humans, because that's we're social animals. Therefore, we crave that getting together, and that applies in our organizations. But at the same time, particularly coming out of the pandemic, as both of you have alluded to, we have this technologically enabled capacity to have a meeting in an instant. And we can have people from 4 different parts of the globe, as we are on this meeting. Yes. And we can do that literally with a half an hour's notice, because we can see where everybody is. We can plug into their calendar. So have we got a contradiction going on here? Instant access, potential overload. Huge benefits, potential downsides.
Well, I guess it's a matter of balance, right? Like I live in Vancouver, so Canada, as I'm sure people who are listening know, is massive. We have multiple time zones. Claire and I are 3 hours apart in terms of our time zone. We're 5,000 kilometers apart, but we work together all the time, both in person and virtually. And the virtual, of course, has now I should preface this by saying the virtual existed before the pandemic, and there were actually lots of virtual facilitators doing virtual work before, and we also a lot of us had Zoom. It's just that now it is more prolific and more people are kind of on it. It's allowed me to do global projects. Claire was global head in an organization for quite some time, and we worked on stuff together, and it definitely can facilitate those kinds of gatherings, and it can be very, very effective. But again, it's like purpose before process. That's the process that you're choosing, but what is the purpose of it? And then how do you, what techniques do you actually use? I had a client who's a global sales team. They had normally before the pandemic, they had met and they had these big sales kind of gatherings and conferences somewhere in the world, usually in like the Bahamas, or, their sales, right? So they would do the thing, and it was 4 days long. So when they called me and they said, okay, so usually we do this in person. We can't do it in person. So we'd like to organize a 4-day virtual event. And I said, no. No, you're not going to do that. And I said, at the most, what we're going to do is like maybe 2 to 3 half-day, kind of 3-hour, like maximum. You can, like, you just have to control like, if you're going to choose that as your kind of vehicle, then you have to think about how are we going to manage the design for energy and participation. And if that's what you need to do in order to get the job done, and that's what works for, the budget, people can't travel, then that's fine. Then do that, but do it well, right? There's ways of doing it well, just like an in-person meeting as well. You want to design it so that it can be really effective and that you're using the right processes. I have a client right now who said, well, I want to get everybody together, and I just want their big ideas. And I'm like, for what? Right? What are they for? Well, just the future. Like, okay, we have to think this through, be thoughtful, think about what's the input, what's the output, and what is the process you're going to use to actually get, what does an idea actually look like? So it's a little bit of upskilling for some of the leaders, even if they're just having small meetings. Get a few techniques, get a few questioning techniques. I would say questioning techniques and frameworks can be one of the most invaluable things that you can ever learn, either for coaching your team or for leading your team and engaging them. And it doesn't require anything physical. You just have to have some really good questions. And, also having like little frameworks, even for the smallest meeting. There's a lovely kind of method framework that goes what, so what now? Right. So no matter what you're doing, even if you're just having a one-on-one with your with a colleague, you can think, just answer the question, what is it we're talking about, or where are we going, or what are our goals? So what does this mean? What are the implications and consequences for us? What are our priorities? And then, so what do we do now? How do we move this into action? So just having some of these little things can transform all kinds of meetings, workshops, engagements, conversations.
Claire, final comment to you before we do a summary wrap up?
I think
No, go ahead.
Sorry, Claire, just to remind our viewers that we are Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. We are here joined by Claire Santamaria, a seasoned executive with expertise in leading high-performance teams, and Tamara Eberle, a strategic facilitator specializing in collaboration and creative problem solving. We are now approaching the end of our show. Over to you, Claire. Sorry, I think I interrupted you, or Martin.
No.
Claire, go ahead.
Not at all. I think, I really do, again, drive back to some of those earlier points that we made around purpose and that consideration, and your thought, Paul, around what if you were hosting your meeting and thinking about and drawing those parallels between a meeting and a wedding, or hosting a wedding. And I do think that there are some thoughtful points there, as we've uncovered, that really do drive, again, that setup and that necessity for purpose, and again, the thinking of the needs of those that are attending as well. So thank you for starting us off that way. I thought that was a fantastic way to start our conversation.
We normally, as we wrap up, guys, I normally try to do a kind of a 1 minute or a minute and a half summary. Claire, you very eloquently started that summary brilliantly, because it took us back to the wedding analogy that Paul provocatively threw in. That pushed us into three things: the invitees, the seating that we might consider, and who we might ask to attend. That brought us down into talking about the purpose, because the meeting purpose dictates who ought to be there. We talked about the possibility, depending on size and scale, of getting everybody's voice heard. Tamara, that brought us into the idea of designing the meeting depending on that purpose, depending on the numbers, and then we can do the math. We can basically say, divide the time by the number of people, we get listening time and we get talking time. And then we can figure out how we got the right people for the right purpose, for the right amount of time in the right setting. The whole meeting design concept, we also then got into talking about meetings in person. We started to talk about meetings online and the enabling capacity that technology has had to create a kind of an explosion of meetings. But I think we kind of concluded that's not necessarily a bad thing, because Claire, you brought us down the road of saying we are human, we benefit from meeting, we have pre-meeting and post-meeting personal connections that can be hugely beneficial and hugely valuable. And then Tamara, you took us into there might be benefit in executives having a small little toolkit of their own. Key questions, key tools, key techniques for managing time, space, purpose, people, venues, in order to maximize the benefits that they're able to extract out of their meetings. We've had a fascinating conversation, guys. We flew through 45 to 50 minutes, believe it or not. And I think we've only just scratched the surface. But really, thank you both for a really interesting and a really thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin, for your usual summary. I call them the golden nuggets. Thank you so much, our guest speakers, for joining us in this interesting fireside chat conversation this afternoon or in the morning, depending on when you are watching us. As we are truly now a global event today. And thank you so much, dear viewers, for watching and live. And also, if you're watching the replay, thank you so much. And leave your comments here on the LinkedIn page. And hope that you can keep following us for upcoming events.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you both. Thank you. Thanks, Tamara.
Bye for now.